Hi students, today we're going to talk about the Renaissance papacy as we look at the politics and culture and society of the Renaissance, especially with the Renaissance presence in Italy. It's obvious that we have to discuss the role and history of the papacy during this period. And the papacy's role in this society is changing. Now, I think this is a fascinating topic to talk about. The common perception is that this is an era of one of the great eras of papal corruption and decline, and this is part of what leads to the Protestant Reformation. Now, there are aspects of that narrative that are certainly true, but the narrative itself is much more complicated, and the people involved are much more complex as well. And so I think it's very important and really fascinating to talk about this this period in the history of the papacy in more detail. Just to give you an outline here, what we're going to see is that the papacy is going to survive a number of challenges to its independence, but at the cost of reducing its spiritual influence and credibility. We're going to see the promotion of art as an important part of the papacy, re-establishing some of that credibility. And so we begin, as always, by looking at the medieval context in which these events take place. Throughout the medieval period, we see papal influence increasing. And a big part of this increase in influence is placing a priority on papal independence. What does that mean when we talk about papal independence? What it means is that there was an effort within the church to make the papacy independent of any kind of outside secular influence. That if you have any kind of secular leverage over the papacy by the other rulers in Europe, that's a way in which the papacy is compromised when it comes to teaching the truth. I'd say when it comes to teaching the truth about some of the different doctrines and practices of the church. So there was this big effort to increase papal independence. A part of that was the development of the papal states, this territory in purple that you see here. Why are the papal states so important? Basically, they provide a buffer zone. It's like, okay, we're going to provide the papacy with land, with an army, with money, revenue raised from these lands, so that the papacy doesn't have to rely on outside forces who can put pressure on the papacy to compromise its teachings. So this was the trend throughout the 13th century and throughout the medieval period, and especially during the 13th century, when the papacy really had the influence to determine the rulers of the different kingdoms. Not that they could just go in making and unmaking them, but at least that they exercised a lot of influence over these rulers, and they could make it very clear that if the ruler didn't comply with what the papacy wanted, they could make it very difficult for that ruler until they did so. Crucial to this success, crucial to the rise of papal influence, was the allegiance or the alliance between the French kings and the papacy. So whenever French kings wanted legitimacy, they turned to the papacy. The papacy would emphasize their legitimacy. Whenever the papacy needed protection, they turned to the French kings to provide them with more military force in order to protect themselves. And this alliance was part of the rivalry between the papacy and the German emperors. We talked about this a little bit previously. The German emperors claim to be the descendants of Charlemagne. They claim the lands of Charlemagne's empire, which include all of Italy. And so there's this tension between the papacy and the German emperors throughout the medieval period. And so it's advantageous for the French monarchs and the papacy to be in alliance with one another. The German emperors are the chief political rivals of the French kings. And the German emperors are also the chief spiritual rivals of the papacy. So supporting the French rulers is not raising up a spiritual rival for the popes. And supporting the popes isn't raising up a political rival for the French kings. So there's this triangle that's going on here. Frederick II was in many ways the emperor who was most threatening to the papacy. He was most threatening to the papacy because of the because of the development that we discussed last time, whereby he comes to rule both the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, but also of the Holy Roman Empire. And so he's the German emperor, but he's also the ruler of Naples and Sicily. This is really scary for the papacy, who want to make sure that their lands aren't surrounded by this single ruler who's claiming to be both a spiritual and a political rival to them. And so the papacy turns to the dynasty they always turn to. They turn to the French rulers. And prince in the ruling French dynasty, Charles of Anjou, drives the descendants of Frederick II out of Sicily and out of Naples in 1266. We talked about this when we talked about the Renaissance history of the Kingdom of Naples. And so the papacy wages war against Frederick II and against his descendants. Charles of Anjou is a very effective ally in the way that the French military forces always have been. And they're successful essentially in breaking the power of the empire. And so these lands in southern Italy are seized from Frederick II's descendants, and the empire is weakened. And so Charles of Anjou establishes a French monarchy in the south of Italy. Now, the issue is here that the papacy has won their struggle against the German emperors, but they've made the French much too strong. And so there was now no real effective counterweight to the French monarchy. We're going to see this with the War of the Sicilian Vespers. So we discussed this when we talked about the Italian city-states as well. We know what happens to Charles of Anjou's French kingdom in the south of Italy. There's an uprising of the Sicilian people, and it's supported by the Kingdom of Aragon in eastern Spain. And so Peter III of Aragon is looking to expand his rule across the Mediterranean and into Sicily. And so Peter of Aragon comes in, seizes this kingdom in southern Italy from the French. The French are outraged. The Pope at the time, Pope Martin IV, who was a Frenchman, called a crusade against the Kingdom of Aragon. And so people at the time recognized this was an abuse of what it meant to fight on crusade. But at the same time, the French have an alliance with the papacy. They have interests in southern Italy, and so they form a crusading army, even though most people recognize that this is a crusade for political means, not religious means. And the crusade itself is a disaster. It's a disaster because the army gets struck by a disease, not the Black Death, but some other disease. Military expeditions are a failure, and even the French king himself, Philip III, dies while the army is retreating across the mountain range of the Pyrenees back into France. So, campaign has been a disaster. What's significant about the campaign is that Philip III dies, and he is succeeded by his son Philip IV. Philip IV, who you see depicted here. Philip IV, we think, was very affected by his father's death. His father had died in his son's eyes because he had listened too closely to the papacy. He allowed his kingdom's foreign policy to be dictated by the papacy. And so Philip IV determines to separate himself from the papacy and to make his kingdom as independent of papal influence as possible. 9 years later, in 1294, there is a highly contentious papal conclave. This is the process by which the cardinals elect a new pope after the previous pope has died. And the cardinals argue, and they can't decide on anyone to succeed the previous pope. And so in the end, they pick this man who was just a humble hermit living in the mountains outside Rome. They say, we agree that he's holy, let's make him the pope. And so this man, this hermit, becomes Pope Celestine V. However, the papacy, as you can see at this time, is not simply an institution that any old holy man can govern. Instead, it requires all kinds of administrative, and political, and diplomatic skills that Celestine simply didn't have. Eventually, he resigns as Pope, and he is replaced by the a much more ambitious Italian cardinal, and we're told that this cardinal even encouraged Celestine to resign. And this cardinal takes the name of Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII is determined to bring the church fully under papal control, and this is going to bring him into conflict with Philip. Boniface complains that Philip is abusing the right of being a crusader. So basically, the way the situation worked was that church lands were typically exempt from taxation. But if you were a Christian ruler who was going to go on crusade and needed to raise money for that crusade, you could tax the lands of the church. So Philip IV has announced that he's going on crusade. He's taxing the lands of the church, but he doesn't actually seem to be raising an army. He doesn't actually seem to be leaving on crusade. Boniface becomes suspicious. So Boniface demands that Philip either leave on crusade or stop taxing the lands of the church. And he issues a letter, and papal letters are known by their first two words, the incipit. And so this letter is called Asculta Fili, which translated into English means "listen, son." Well, it's a little bit patronizing. And Philip IV writes back, and he rejects the authority of Boniface to meddle in his kingdom in this way. And he says, from now on, revenues raised from the lands of the church, I'm not going to allow them to leave the French kingdom. They're going to have to stay in the kingdom of France. They're not going to go to the papacy. Boniface responds with another letter, again named for its first two Latin words, unam sanctam, one holy. And in this letter, he declares the authority of the Pope to choose who is the ruler of any Christian kingdom. He says the Pope is called to be the ultimate shepherd of the souls of all Christians. And souls are more important than bodies. Kings only rule over bodies. Therefore, if it's in the interest of the souls of a Christian kingdom to have a different ruler, I have the authority, the Pope has the authority to depose that ruler. And this is why Boniface VIII is significant. He's significant because he represents the high watermark of medieval papal power. That you now have a medieval pope who's claiming the right even to choose to remove a king from his throne. However, Philip is going to call Boniface's bluff. And he says, you may be the shepherd of souls, but I'm the shepherd of bodies, and in this world, bodies are more powerful. And he sends an army into Italy, and he captures Boniface. Boniface is eventually rescued, but dies shortly afterwards. We think he probably died of shock. And so Boniface dies very quickly after this, and Philip is going to have a large hand in the election of the next pope. Imagine that the popes and the cardinals feel very vulnerable. They've just seen an army storm the palace of the pope and make him their prisoner. And so when Philip says, I really think you should elect this guy, they go along with it. And they elect a new pope who takes the name of Clement V. And Clement is someone who was a chaplain to the French court. So he's from France. He's used to having a relationship with Philip where he is the subordinate, Philip is the superior. And Philip says, I really don't want us to fall out in the same way that I fell out with Boniface. I think you should move the papacy to the French lands, to the French city of Avignon. It's actually a city that's owned by the papacy at the time, but it's inside the Kingdom of France. And Clement feels a little vulnerable, just in the same way that the other cardinals had, and so he agrees. And so for the next 70 years, papacy is going to reside not in Rome, but in this city of Avignon, where they're going to build this giant papal palace that you see here. We'll talk about what this means for the papacy in the next video.